What is literature? What storytelling or types of storytelling gets to count as literature, and who is to decide? Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture of literature. I'm Andrew Fort, and we are here for a video which will appear in two different playlists here on the channel. Number one being the Friday Reads playlist, where I try to tackle random issues as far as literature is concerned, and number two is the Stephen King playlist here on the channel, a playlist of reviews and discussions of Stephen King's work. Now, what we are actually here to talk about today is how much Harold Bloom hated Stephen King. And I know the thumbnail says hates, but it's a much better thumbnail than if it said hated. Now, Harold Bloom was an absolute icon in literary criticism. This is not to say that everything he said was worth listening to. It's, well, worth listening to, yes. Worth accepting wholesale, I don't think so. I disagree with Bloom on a lot of things. I do agree with Harold Bloom on his takes on Emily Dickinson, but that's not who we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about the opposite side of that spectrum from Harold Bloom's opinion. Harold Bloom loved Emily Dickinson, or at least really said positive things about Emily Dickinson. And on the other side of that spectrum is where Harold Bloom talked about Stephen King. Now, Harold Bloom said, "Read deeply, not to believe, not to accept, not to contradict, but to learn to share in that one nature that writes and reads." The end of that quote is a little bit shady as far as having anything worth listening to, but the beginning of it, I think, talks very deeply, suggests that Bloom accepts critical reading as imperative, which is to suggest that the reader, his or herself, is paramount in the creation of the literary experience. But Bloom was a notoriously strict bouncer at the club of what he considered to be literary or even worthwhile. The article we're about to read is what Harold Bloom said when Stephen King was given an award, and Harold Bloom kind of, lost it. In an article titled "For the World of Letters, It's a Horror" by Harold Bloom from September 19th, 2003. So we're going back 22 years to get this, but I think that this is as important today as ever it was, because I think that from this moment, the world of literature has taken several steps backwards. However, I will disagree with Harold Bloom on why that is. We get a little bit here about Harold Bloom. Harold Bloom is a professor at Yale, a literary critic and author of The Western Canon from 1995. Several books from Harold Bloom, all of them worth looking at. But here is where Harold Bloom starts. The decision to give the National Book Foundation's annual award for distinguished contribution to Stephen King is extraordinary. Another low in the shocking process of dumbing down our cultural life. I've described King in the past as a writer of penny dreadfuls, but perhaps even that is too kind. He shares nothing with Edgar Allan Poe. What he is an immensely inadequate writer, on a sentence-by-sentence, paragraph-by-paragraph, book-by-book basis. This is, in my opinion, why Harold Bloom believes that Stephen King is an immensely inadequate writer, is because Stephen King is not particularly a writer. Though novels are his medium, King instead is more of a storyteller. His stories will embody whatever medium they have to in order to make the most sense to Stephen King, the writer. You see this with the sort of hokey storytelling at the beginning of It, right? What is it? The horror, so far as I know or can tell, started on the 5th of August 1955, whatever the date is, but it's sort of this storyteller mode that our narrator has taken. Is this storyteller mode less literary? Well, yeah, probably. There is not as much depth per paragraph in Stephen King as Hemingway provided. That's why Hemingway was notoriously brief in his writing. But this is the National Book Foundation awarding for distinguished contributions. This is not the Shakespeare Society giving an award for the most double entendres in a sonnet. That's not what this is. This is, word for word, the National Book Foundation's award for distinguished contribution. To not think that Stephen King has contributed to literature in some way, to reading in some way, to the storytelling process in some way, is, I think, short-sighted at best. I think really what it was is not short-sighted. I really do think that what Harold Bloom was doing here was trying to maintain dignity in what he saw as the schism between literature and writing. And I think he just went over the edge on this. And this video is going to see me defend J.K. Rowling. Okay, so that is very uncomfortable for me, but we will have to do it. The publishing industry has stooped terribly low to bestow on King a lifetime award that has previously gone to the novelists Saul Bellow and Philip Roth and playwright Arthur Miller. By awarding it to King, they recognize nothing but the commercial value of his books, which sell in the millions but do little more for humanity than keep the publishing world afloat. If this is going to be the criterion for the future, then perhaps next year the committee should give its award for distinguished contribution to Danielle Steele. And pardon me. And surely the Nobel Prize for Literature should go to J.K. Rowling. The publishing industry does owe Stephen King their hide. The problem that I have with this argument is the problem that I have every time this argument pops up, and it's not just here, it's not just in literature, it's not just in publishing, it is over and over again. Don't blame the winners. Don't blame Marvel for selling tickets to the movies because your indie film flopped. Don't blame the winners. The commercial value is the on-ramp to other more serious writers. This is something that, more serious writers, this is something that Harold Bloom is going to try to shoot down later, but he just tries to shoot it down by assertion. There's no weight behind what it is that he says when he tries to shoot it down. You don't blame the winners for keeping the market afloat, especially. So it's one thing to blame the winners for the attention that they garner, right? If everyone were given 5 movie tickets at the beginning of every month and they had to go see 5 movies, 10 years ago, most of those tickets would have gone to Marvel films, and it wouldn't have been that they were making any money if everyone were allotted tickets. You get what I'm saying? If this were some imaginary world where you had to go to 5 movies a month, Marvel movies still would have won. The Marvel movies making all that money kept so many other studios in business, kept the theaters in business, and we're seeing, in the absence of Marvel being a great cinematic universe, as Marvel has fallen, so too are other movie studios. So too are the theaters in general. So don't blame the winners. That is silly. The next paragraph here, what's happening is part of a phenomenon I wrote about a couple of years ago when I was asked to comment on Rowling. Rowling rolling? I went to the Yale bookstore and bought and read a copy of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. I suffered a great deal in the process. Woe is me. Verklempt here with Harold Bloom. The writing was dreadful. The book was terrible. As I read, I noticed that every time a character went for a walk, the author wrote instead that the character stretched his legs. I began marking on the back of an envelope every time that phrase was repeated. I stopped only after I had marked the envelope several dozen times. I was incredulous. Rowling's mind is so governed by cliches and dead metaphors that she has no other style of writing. Rowling's writing, really her diction, if we're being fair, is of the culture rather than culture forming, right? So this is not the biggest sin. I don't understand. It's bad writing, but it's not the biggest sin in the world. To employ cliches in your writing, there's here's the thing. Here's the thing I noticed about that when I got out of college. Before I went to college, and it took me a long time to get to go to college, I was not a trust fund baby or something like that, right? I had to work my way through community college to go off to college, and that alone took me 5 years. I used to absolutely love turns of phrase. I used to absolutely love cliche. Why? Because I knew exactly what it meant immediately once it happened on the page. Only after being taught to read critically did I start to hate the employment of cliche. So, yeah, I hate reading cliches now, but before I had a wealth of experience in reading literature, it was useful for me to get purchase page by page by recognizing phrases in the writing. So, yeah, it sucks to read cliches now that I've had my eyes open to cliches, but it doesn't ruin anything for me. Sometimes it does. Sometimes, Dan Brown. When I tried to read Dan Brown after having my eyes open to cliches, it was absolutely miserable. But who cares? Why is this that big of a deal? Harold Bloom. And look, I love Harold Bloom. Okay, so I know this video is going to sound like me complaining against Harold Bloom a lot, but I promise it is not that. But when I wrote that in a newspaper, I was denounced. I was told that the children would now go on. I was told that children would now only read J.K. Rowling, and I was asked whether that wasn't, after all, better than reading nothing at all. If Rowling was what it took to make them pick up a book, wasn't that a good thing? It's not. Harry Potter will not lead our children on to Kipling's Just So stories or his Jungle Book. It will not lead them to Thurber's 13 Clocks. I had to slow down to make sure I got that one right. Or Kenneth Graham's Wind in the Willows or Lewis Carroll's Alice. Yes, it is a good thing. Why do you get to say that it won't do those things? For me, it was reading simpler texts that led me to a love of Hemingway, led me to a love of Faulkner, led me to a love of Emily Dickinson. It was being able to grasp and grapple with simpler texts that provided me the on-ramp to the literary experience, a hefty literary experience, a literary experience. This is that assertion earlier that I talked about where Harold Bloom just kind of says, no, it doesn't make you read better things if you start on simpler texts. Yes, in fact, it does. Later, I read a lavish, loving review of Harry Potter by the same Stephen King. He wrote something to the effect of, if these kids are reading Harry Potter at 11 or 12, then when they get older, they will go on to read Stephen King. And he was quite right. He was not being ironic. When you read Harry Potter, you are in fact trained to read Stephen King. I think that he was being ironic, maybe not ironic as much as just humorful. This does fit in with a large deal of Stephen King's humor. Stephen King's pre-2016 humor, where he was at times very cheekily self-effacing. This would have been Stephen King suggesting the reason I like J.K. Rowling is that she's sending all of her readers to me and I get to sell more books than God for the rest of the time that I'm alive. Now, little did he know that his writing would quickly diminish. Stephen King's last few books, in my opinion, not very good. But I think that he was being ironic or at least humorful. But Bloom also separately argued that art is quote unquote useless. So, if there is simply a question of taste in a useless exercise, Bloom's argument is a moot point. Who cares if art is useless? Harold, our society our society and our literature and our culture are being dumbed down. And the causes are very complex. I'm 73 years old. In a lifetime of teaching English, I've seen the study of literature debased. There's very little authentic study of the humanities remaining. My research assistant came to me 2 years ago saying that she'd been in a seminar in which the teacher spent 2 hours saying that Walt Whitman was a racist. This isn't even good nonsense. It's insufferable. Well, the Walt Whitman is a racist crowd. That's not the same crowd as the Stephen King is literature crowd. Trust me, I had to take all of my courses once I finally afforded to move myself away to college and take college courses. All of my courses came from the Walt Whitman is racist people. I don't like them any more than do you. And Mr. Bloom, I hope posthumously, you will accept my olive branch as we together turn to wage war on the identity politics crowd together. This was in 2003. 22 years ago, these identity politics had already crept into college campuses, had already taken over the humanities departments, had already, quote unquote, debased the teaching of English literature. When I got to college 5 years, 6 years later than this, it was even worse than simply Walt Whitman was a racist. Everything was racist. Everything was sexist. Everything was every-ist that you could think of. Everyone was every-ist that you can think of. Every action was every ism that you can think of. That's how far the colleges in the United States had already fallen 20 years ago. Okay, so we're going to move on from that because that is not the actual argument I am hoping to make in this video, but it is something that is close to my heart. I began as a scholar of the Romantic poets. In the 1950s and early 1960s, it was understood that the great English Romantic poets were Percy Bysshe Shelley, William Wordsworth, Lord Byron, John Keats, William Blake, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, but today they are Felicia Hemans, Charlotte Smith, Mary Tighe, Letitia Landon, and others who just can't write. A fourth-rate playwright like Aphra Behn is being taught instead of Shakespeare in many curricula across the country. Again, Mr. Bloom, this is not the same crowd. The people who want to read Stephen King are not the same people who want to debase the teaching of English in these very ways of which you speak. These are very different crowds indeed. A person who finds a love for reading through Stephen King or Aphra Behn, for that matter, is better off than a person who tries to read Shakespeare and quits reading because it's too hard. Reading is, after all, just like anything else. It takes practice, it takes skill building, and you don't just start at the top. If maybe one day someone who read Stephen King makes their way to George Saunders, makes their way to Philip Roth, makes their way then to Ernest Hemingway, then to Shakespeare. There are a progression of things. It happens all the time. I don't know who you were talking to that made you think that it didn't. If you want to bench press 315 pounds, you don't put it on the bar. You start with 135 and you see if you can get that. And then you add another wheel to each side and you're up to 225. And eventually, someday, maybe, you get that final wheel and it is 315. But if you sit down to bench press 315 and you cannot bench press 135, you never have, you didn't know you couldn't, that bar is going straight through your rib cage and into your heart. That is how we lose so many readers before they are actually readers. Today, there are 4 living American novelists I know of who are still at work and who deserve our praise. Thomas Pynchon is still writing. My friend Philip Roth, who will now share this Distinguished Contribution Award with Stephen King, is a great comedian and would no doubt find something funny to say about it. There's Cormac McCarthy, whose novel Blood Meridian is worthy of Herman Melville's Moby Dick, and Don DeLillo, whose Underworld is a great book. Oh no, I have ruined everything. Sorry about that. I didn't ruin everything. It turns out I'm just an idiot and I jumbled some of this up. So, the next paragraph here. Recently, I spoke at the funeral of my old friend Thomas N. Green of Yale, perhaps the most distinguished scholar of Renaissance literature of his generation. I said, I fear that something of great value has ended forever. Cool story, bro. This is the original last week I tweeted quote here, but then he goes on to end the article like this. Instead, this year's award goes to King. A terrible mistake. Now, this is the same. So, first off, this ending proves that Bloom wasted his time here. Instead of making the point that someone should have gotten it, he really just spent his entire article arguing that Stephen King shouldn't have. If your point was that someone else should have won the award, make that argument, make that statement, do that thing. Don't spend words just tearing someone else down, like I'm doing in this video. That is reserved for YouTube, not Los Angeles Times articles. But here's the funniest thing to me. King winning this one time in 2003 didn't mean that no one else could win it later. This was a lifetime type of award. This was not for a specific publication in a specific year. It was an award for things that Stephen King had contributed, and certainly Stephen King had contributed. By the way, this very same award, this article was written in 2003. Do you know who won that award in 1999? Oprah Winfrey. I wonder what Bloom's favorite of Oprah's sonnets was. No, I guess probably it was not quite as fashionable to write an argument tearing down Oprah Winfrey as it would be to write an article tearing down Stephen King. Stephen King is not a sacred one, as he was a writer of horror fiction and not the darling of daytime television, right? So Stephen King, it's easy to look down on Stephen King. It's easy to kick dirt on Stephen King. It's easy to say that Stephen King is not a literary force. Stephen King has written a whole lot more books than had Oprah Winfrey in 1999. So what is the award really for? I imagine, without going back and checking, because this is stuff that's nearly 30 years old, I imagine that Oprah Winfrey was given the award not for her writing, but probably for the Oprah Book Club. That was a very big thing at that time. It got a lot of people reading. It made a lot of people open books they never would have opened. Not all of them were literary prizes either. Some of those books probably would not have made it onto Harold Bloom's bookshelf. So why not go ahead and allow for Stephen King to win the same award for making people read that presumably Oprah Winfrey won for making people read? There is a very, very troubling phenomenon. I think it's troubling, but probably I'm guilty of it too, of looking at things that you don't like and saying they're not good enough. My whole argument, my whole shtick about literature is that most of what we consider to be literature is with the reader, not the writer. There are certain texts, for sure, that are more easily classified as literature than others. Anybody can pick up Shakespeare and say, yeah, man, that's probably literature. Very hard to do by picking up any random book off of the Walmart bookshelf and reading through it. In my opinion, one of the things that literature really does is it teaches us about ourselves. No matter how much you know about yourself. If you pick up Shakespeare and you can read it, because it's not easy, you pick up Shakespeare and you can read it, you're going to learn something about yourself. No matter how little you know about yourself, if you pick up Shakespeare and you can't read it, you're not going to learn anything about yourself. So a lot of the literary merit of a story comes from the reader themselves. Someone like Stephen King has sold so many books because he is able to reach out and meet people where they are. So someone who is a very, very experienced reader can read The Shining, and he or she is going to have a much different experience than someone who's not a very seasoned reader. However, as long as the reader is putting their full reading effort into the book, the experience with which they come away from The Shining is going to be fulfilling. They are going to get everything out of that book that they put in. That is an incredible thing. And if someone does not have the tools to read Shakespeare, they can still pick up The Shining and learn things about themselves. And if they can't, there's nothing in there they are not a precise reader. They are not a critical reader. The act of reading what is The Shining? 400 pages? 450 pages? The act of reading a 450-page book gets them closer to that reality. That is all I have for this video. If you like or appreciate what it is that I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. If you find yourself here by chance but not design, literature is the only thing I talk about on this channel, dropping multiple videos every week. There's poetry every Monday, and as always, I hope to have you back for the next one.